All right, so we're in the Catechism, question 10, and if you look at the top, you see this section is labeled sin. Yeah, so far in the Catechism, we've given an introduction of the Christian story, then we've looked at the doctrine of God, right, and then we looked at the purpose of life, and now we're moving into the doctrine of sin. So, question 10, what is sin? Sin is disobeying God's law, which we know through both the Bible and our conscience. So what is sin? Sin is disobeying God's law, which we know through both the Bible and our conscience. So let's look at the first one there. What is sin? Sin is disobeying God's law. Let's look at 1 John 3:4. And by the way, when you're taking new believers through this, you can imagine it's quite a mission looking up all these page references. What I found is, for some people, I've just encouraged them to get an app on their phone because it's proper easy for people to look up Bible references now with apps on their phone. So I find new believers can find, the book of Joel in a few seconds, whereas back in the day, both of you would be there for a while trying to find it, But the other thing I do is, I know one guy who he just liked using a proper paper Bible. And, with him, I just said, go to the front of your Bible. He'd go to the table of contents, he'd look it up and find the page number and look it up that way. And when I asked him if he wanted to do it another way, he said, I like this way because then I learn where all the books are. So, what can seem like a difficulty can actually be used as an advantage in terms of now someone's also learning where all the books in the Bible are. You might need to explain to them at some point that the books aren't in chronological order. And if they're doing some of you might have this now, you're doing the Robert Murray McShane reading plan, and when you're in January at the beginning, one of the chapters starts at Ezra. So it can be really confusing when someone's reading Genesis and then they're also reading Ezra and not realizing how much history there is in between the time period of those two books. But these are all good discipleship opportunities to explain to people. So could someone read out 1 John 3:4, please? So how is sin described here? Lawlessness. Okay, so what is sin? Sin is disobeying God's law. Now, I don't think this is in the teacher's guide, but you might be aware at the moment that there's debate about how to define sin, and some people are trying to come up with new ways to define sin to help non-believers understand it better. Has anyone heard any of the new ways people are trying to define sin? So one of the ways is selfishness. Some people are saying, well, sin is basically selfishness. But whilst it's true that sin is selfishness, one of the problems with that definition is it doesn't show you that you're actually going against God. So I could be selfish and you tell me I'm being selfish, but you haven't actually shown me you are rebelling against God, your creator. So that's why here in the Catechism we actually define it as disobeying God's law. Some people are also trying to define sin these days as idolatry, and they're saying that's easier for non-believers to understand sin as idolatry. I'm not convinced myself personally that the Bible really clearly lays sin out as idolatry, but it does clearly lay it out as lawlessness. I'm also not too sure if in our culture, if idolatry is a concept that is that helpful. I think it is helpful, but I'm not too sure if, let's put it this way, people I grew up with, that breaking the law is something that everyone's pretty comfortable with and understand, right? When I start talking about idolatry, people be like, what, you mean like the Chinese shop with the little shrine in there, and then you got to explain, no, we're all idolaters. And so I find the breaking the law one quite easy. So what is sin? Sin is disobeying God's law, which we know through both the Bible and our conscience. So let's look up that one, number 2. Let's look at Romans 2:12-16. So what does it mean when people who don't know the Bible still obey God's law about not committing murder?
God's law is written on their heart.
God's law is written on their hearts. Thank you. So it's written on their hearts. It's in, what do we call that? Conscience. Yeah, it's in their conscience. Okay, so how will God judge people who never had Bibles? According to this verse. According to their conscience, right? Yeah. So I've got a picture of a faraway tribe there. I don't know if anyone's ever asked you this question. If anyone's ever asked you, what about people who never had the Bible? Has anyone ever been asked that? Right, okay. So in response to that, we would say, if there was a tribe somewhere that never had the Bible, never given God's law in written form or verbal form, they would be judged by their conscience. God would say to them, you knew it was wrong to steal, and yet you stole. You knew it was wrong to lie, and yet you lied. By your own conscience, you are guilty. And for some of us who are car drivers, you think about how we judge other people on the road. Someone cuts us up, and we're like, it's bang out of order. Someone does that thing where they don't look at us because they don't want to let us in, and we're like, look at them, so selfish. We have all these standards. Well, what if on Judgment Day we were just judged by those standards? What if God just said, okay, did you ever cut anyone up? Did you ever not make eye contact because you didn't want to let them in and you were pretending you couldn't see them? Did you ever cheekily jump in front of someone? If you did, then by your own conscience right there, you could be found guilty, let alone going through the 10 commandments and judging you by what's been written down. So what is sin? Sin is disobeying God's law, which we know through both the Bible and our conscience. So in the teacher's guide there, I've written under for further study, we either disobey God by disobeying what we know he has written in his word, or by disobeying what our conscience tells us. We either disobey God by disobeying what we know he's written in his word, or by disobeying what our conscience tells us. And it's interesting, in Luke 19:22, Jesus says to someone, I will judge you by your own words. So it's like, even there you got the example, well, I'll judge you by your own words, what you've been saying, let me judge you by that. Anyone got any questions on that?
Sometimes when I'm doing this, people are really smart, they say to me that, what about people who have corrupt consciences where they'll think they're doing it for their gods and stuff and they won't feel bad about it? Then what?
So the question is, what if someone said to you, well, this tribe, they're doing things wrong, but their conscience has been corrupted. They think they're doing it for their gods, so it, in that sense, it's okay. It's a good question. I think there's a number of ways to tackle that. One is the fact that in the Bible, we are still culpable for having a hardened conscience. So when you read in Romans about having hard hearts, why does God let us have hard hearts?
He gives us over to our own reprobate mind. So we've already done these things and he gives us over to it and says, okay, well, this is what you want. Great.
Thanks. So basically it says in Romans that God gives us, he gives us over to, let's look at the exact verse so we don't end up, Romans chapter 1,
28.
Romans 1:28. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. So there it's saying people thought it's not worth keeping the knowledge of God, and then God says, right, I'm going to give you over to a depraved mind now. And if you go back a little bit further to what we did the other week, verse 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. So the Bible would say they did know God in a sense. If you go back earlier, you've got verse 20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So the answer is, from creation, those people have known there's a God. They've known there's one creator God, but they have what they've wanted. Like Harriet said, God says, here, you can have what you want. So they're like, no, we don't want God. We want gods, multiple gods to worship. We want anything but follow the true God. And God gives them over to that, and he lets them get all into that there. That you could say their consciences get hardened when they're making sacrifices to this other God, but they're still culpable for that. Culpable in the sense that God doesn't say, oh, I'll let you off the hook because you didn't know. So the thing with our sin is that deep down it's always what we want to do. You know, so we can never say, well, I did this because I was beaten as a kid. That's why I beat that guy up. It's like, no, we beat the guy up because we wanted to beat the guy up. That deep down, that's, yeah. Did our conscience get hardened through things that have happened to us in our life? Yeah, that can happen, especially the way we sinfully respond to how people have sinned against us. That hardens our conscience. But on the day of judgment, we can't say, yeah, but God, look, my conscience was hard. He'd say, you wanted your conscience to be hard. Does that make sense? Yeah. So try that on them and see what they come back with, and then let me know. Okay, so the application question now to ask the person next to you is, if you were judged by your own conscience, would you be found innocent or guilty? So just ask that to the person next to you.